Hello, and welcome to our call. My name is Paul Da Silva. I am the VP responsible for franchise and retail brands with Royal Bank of Canada. As a result of COVID, the restaurant industry has been one of the hardest hit industries with lockdown orders, shutting down dining rooms, taking quick serves and reducing traffic, laying off staff, and so on. At the same time, bills are piling up. Rent has to be paid, utilities have to be paid, and so on. And as we move through this crisis, the fundamental question a lot of our clients are asking is, how do I make money in this environment? When will I start making money? And so to help you with that, our guest today will help with some of those questions to get you back on the road to normal. And with that, let me introduce our co-host as well as our guest. My co-host for today is Laura Davey, who is our National Director of Retail Markets at Royal Bank of Canada. Our guest today is David Hopkins, President and founder of 15 Group. David has over 30 years experience in the restaurant industry. He began his career after graduating in 1990 with honors in a business degree from Queen's University. In 1990 to 1997, David focused on restaurant operations and held various senior management positions at some of Toronto's top restaurants. In 1997, David joined Surcorp to lead their financial and accounting department in one of the most profitable divisions, Signature Restaurants, which included Al Fazoli's, Al Frisco's, Fariente, and Red's. And during his 5 years at Surcorp, David reconstructed the division's information processing into a centralized accounting department and helped that division grow from 4 restaurants to 9, each with sales over $4 million. This development also included the roll-up of Alice Fazoli's. In 2001, David left Surcorp to form 15 Group, one of North America's leading hospitality consultancy. With offices in both Toronto and Vancouver, they have over 30 industry experts that cover all aspects of restaurant operations, from developing new restaurant concepts to maximizing restaurant profits, to effective sales generation and disciplined cost management. The 15 Group clients range from owner-operator establishments to multi-unit restaurant corporations. With that, I want to turn it over to Laura and to David. Over to you, Laura.
Thanks so much, Paul, for the kind introduction, and welcome to our guest today, David. I know that you've got many years of experience in the restaurant industry. Can you share with us some of your insights over the last couple of months about how the restaurant industry has been affected by the pandemic?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Great to be here. You know, the restaurant industry has been one of the hardest hit industries through this pandemic. You know, and it's an industry that was always challenged to begin with. It's not a high profit margin industry. So when the lockdowns happened recently, you know, it was incredibly hard on restaurants just to survive. Statistics coming out now are saying that 10 to 20% of restaurants won't reopen when this pandemic ends, or once restaurants even get to reopen. And the ones that do get to reopen are facing what seem like really daunting times. So they've got challenges ahead of them, including, you know, capacity restrictions enforced by the government, staffing issues. They definitely have the challenges of supply chain and supply chain costs. And also, of course, the consumer demand is a concern, and whether or not consumers will embrace restaurants the same way they did pre-COVID. So all this, you know, makes a kind of a daunting landscape for restaurateurs if they do get the luxury of being able to reopen. The thing from our perspective is it may look daunting, but with the right approach, this is actually a tremendous opportunity for restaurants as opposed to something to be wary of in the future. And that's for a number of different reasons. The first thing I think that's important for restaurants to understand is that, you know, a 50% capacity reduction doesn't necessarily mean a 50% revenue reduction. So, you know, it only affects restaurants to the fullest if you were busy 7 days a week at 100% capacity. But if you were slow, you know, let's say on Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday nights, you were only at 50% capacity to begin with, then this restriction doesn't hurt you at all on those nights. The other thing we're finding with reopening is that guests are changing the way that they eat. So your meal periods, your service periods are getting extended. So, as an example, if your lunch rush used to be between 12 and 1:30, now your lunch rush might come from 11:30 to 1:30, or sorry, to 2 o'clock. And you might extend that lunch rush and thereby capture some of that reduced capacity in the shoulder periods, if you know what I mean. So that's the first thing. We're expecting restaurants are really going to see a decline more in the region of 30 to 40% of revenues, not a full 50%. The other interesting thing that's going on right now is when it comes to kind of economic principles and what's going on with supply and demand. So we know demand's going to be reduced for restaurants. We know that people like my parents who are 82 years old, they're not going to go to restaurants the same way they used to, if they even go at all. So we know that there's going to be demand reduction post-COVID. But early indications are that it won't be as bad as people think. So, a survey that was done a few weeks ago indicated that, demand was still going to be at about 60% of what it was pre-COVID. The survey found that 60% of respondents said they still would go to restaurants once they reopen. So to me, that's a positive sign, because we think that's only going to get better as people become more accustomed to the pandemic. The interesting thing is what's happening on the supply side. So, if we look at the pool of restaurant seats available pre-COVID as 100%, we've already said that unfortunately 10 to 20% of restaurants aren't going to reopen because of the pandemic. So now our seating capacity, our available seating to supply the demand, is reduced to 80 to 90% of what it was pre-COVID. And we know that government restrictions are in place, limiting us to roughly 50% capacity. So the available capacity, the supply of restaurant seats, is now sitting at about 40 to 45% of what it was pre-COVID. So we have 60 to 70% of demand versus 40 to 45% of supply. And that, to me, is a great opportunity.
Based on what you just said, it sounds like you're thinking there will be an increase in demand for restaurants and demand outweighing the supply. So assuming that is the case, what opportunities does this offer restaurant owners as they start to reopen?
Yeah, that's 100% what we're expecting to see, is that demand in excess of supply. And that's what we call a seller's market. And in my 30 years of restaurant experience, I haven't seen that across the country at any given time. Certainly, we see that in certain tourist markets, and you probably know what I'm talking about. You go to a summer tourist destination, and there's a huge excess of demand and not enough restaurants to supply. And what you see in that environment is restaurants that have increased prices compared to what you're used to. So certainly from our perspective, this market condition allows the opportunity for many restaurants to potentially increase prices. I think it's important, a lot of people say, well, we're in the middle of a recession, you can't increase prices. I think it's important that people realize we're not talking about a dramatic increase of prices. We're not talking about doubling prices to offset these capacity restrictions. Most people don't realize that even a 17% price increase will offset a 40% capacity or guest traffic restriction in a restaurant. I think it's important that restaurants evaluate their own opportunity, and each restaurant's going to be unique, but certainly these market conditions, in my mind, present the potential opportunity to increase prices. And the other thing is we don't necessarily recommend you just increase prices across the board. I mean, there's definitely a strategic way to do it to minimize the impact and the perception to the guest while still capturing more money to go to the bottom line. Now, the other interesting thing that these conditions allow restaurants to look at, regardless of the pandemic and COVID, when we talk about doing price increases in restaurant, we always look at it in the framework of what we call value proposition. And value proposition is the difference between what a guest is experiencing and what they're paying for that. And the difference between those two things is the value proposition. And that's what drives all guest traffic to restaurants. So to increase that value proposition, you can basically do one of two things. You can either increase the guest experience or you can decrease the price point. And this whole situation, this market condition, gives restaurants the opportunity to do something that, again, I've never seen in 30 years of being in the restaurant industry. And that is they've got this golden opportunity to increase the guest experience and therefore increase that value proposition.
So it's quite obvious that the new reality offers some opportunities for restaurant owners to rethink their current value proposition. When you speak about the opportunity to elevate the guest experience, is that related to some of the government programs that are available? And if so, how can restaurant owners use those government programs to take advantage of the opportunity?
Yeah, Laura, 100%. I'm completely talking about the government program, most specifically the wage subsidy program. That's a program that, it came out and it didn't do a lot for restaurants at the start, when they were in the lockdown period, because there wasn't a lot of wages to be subsidized. But now that restaurants are reopening, it's a huge opportunity for restaurants. And, the government just announced that they were going to extend this program out till the end of December. And for the short term, most restaurants will get a 75% wage subsidy, and then it's going to change from there in the fall. But that's a huge opportunity for restaurants in kind of two ways. The first and the most obvious way is that it's money in their pocket, right? It's a subsidy against wages that goes and helps them combat the bottom line pressures from the capacity restrictions. So that's obvious. That's a huge win for restaurants, and that's a big part of it. The second advantage or benefit of this wage subsidy, and the one that we're hugely excited about that I just touched on, is the ability that it gives restaurants to really increase that guest experience. So when we talk about increasing guest experience and the value proposition, that's all delivered by what your staff do. So if I'm at a restaurant, it's the staff that greet me at the door, it's the staff that take me to my table, it's the staff that take the order, that bring me my drink in a timely fashion. Ideally, it's the staff that cook my meal properly. Everything that happens within a restaurant environment, or at least almost everything, is delivered by the staff, and that's what elevates the guest experience. And we're in a unique situation where the government has said, we're going to pay a whole lot of your staff wages so that you can operate effectively. And that gives us as restaurateurs a huge opportunity to elevate that guest experience. So whatever it is that we need to do, we have the ability to do it without that huge expense. When we're looking at elevating guest experience, it's a constant battle in restaurants between how do I elevate the guest experience to the best it can be, but then also keep my labor in check. And right now, the government said, well, we're going to help you with the labor factor, and that allows us to focus on guest experience. So if I need to start doing a whole bunch of staff training so my staff can execute better, the government has said, we're going to pick up a huge chunk of that expense, and it allows me to do it more effectively. If I want to, on a busy dinner rush, put another host on, where it used to pre-COVID cost me, let's say, $80 to put a host on, now I can do that for, in the short term, the government will pick up $60 of it, and even into the fall, they're going to pick up a good chunk of it. So it allows me to elevate the guest experience. And even, most dramatically, if I wanted to hire a full-time manager and call them a guest experience manager, and all they do is make sure that every guest has a 10 out of 10 experience instead of an 8 out of 10 experience. Pre-COVID, that might have cost me $4,000 a month. But now in the short term, it's going to cost me $1,000 a month, and going into the fall, maybe $2,000 or $2,500. Either way, however you look at it, we've got this huge opportunity to elevate the guest experience, which that in itself also allows us to potentially look at a price increase in helping our overall profit model succeed.
So I love how you kind of reframed the issue, in that when we think about what really drives the restaurant experience, it really is about staff. And we know that wages are typically one of the higher costs that restaurants do have to incur. So I think it's a great way to look at how can we take what we have today to really help our, to really elevate our experience, elevate our value proposition, and do that much better of a job going forward. And I know that we've talked about this in the past where it gives you the opportunity too to measure and look at that feedback loop. If we do add this, how are we doing in the short term so that long term we're better set up for success? So if we move things along a little bit, I know that in this new COVID world, there's always that added component of cleanliness and sanitation now that restaurants have to be aware of. How does this play into the future for restaurants?
Yeah, you know what, Laura, that's an excellent comment. You know, obviously cleanliness and sanitation, you know, they've always been big in restaurants, but obviously now it's bigger than it's ever been, and it's more important than it's ever been. We used to talk in restaurants about the 3 pillars of success being quality, service, and atmosphere. And anybody who's been in restaurants for a while knows those 3 items. Those are the 3 pillars. And we're now starting to talk about it as 4 pillars: quality, service, atmosphere, and cleanliness. And the interesting thing right now is that cleanliness is pretty much outweighing the other 3 pillars. So, you know, people would much rather have a mediocre meal with mediocre service in a super clean environment where they feel safe than have a great meal with great service in an environment where they thought that it was unsafe and unsanitary and unclean. So the sanitation part is a huge factor, and I think that's going to extend far beyond COVID. I think we've basically been conditioned over the last little while, and will continue to be conditioned to basically live as a cleaner society. So I think this is going to be something important moving forward long past COVID. The interesting thing that we're seeing, though, with restaurants that are reopening right now is that there's a huge relationship between cleanliness and sanitation and trust in a restaurant brand. And people associate a brand trust with keeping me safe when I go into your restaurant. So we're seeing a better rebound from chain restaurants, from well-branded restaurants, than we are from the independents and the mom and pa's, so to speak. So I think it's important that people know, whether you're a chain restaurant, a branded restaurant, or whether you're a little mom and pa, it's extremely important that restaurants realize that association and make sure that everything they're doing in all of their communication channels, in the way they present themselves, that they're putting forward an extremely polished, extremely professional, branded experience for restaurants, because for their restaurant, because the consumer associates that with health and safety. And I think that's incredibly important. If you want to win the guest over, they've got to, from the moment they look at your website or think about going to your restaurant to the moment they leave, they need that polished experience to make them feel safe.
I couldn't agree with you more. I find a lot of restaurants have been doing this for years, and it's a matter of communicating that back to the guests so that they're aware of what really does go into that operation. So as we kind of wrap it up here, I know that there's a lot of restaurants that did lose a good portion of their revenue throughout the pandemic for a while. And I mean, some of those restaurants, if we think of examples, could be restaurants doing a lot of catering. And even, for example, I know in downtown Toronto, we have restaurants where maybe curbside pickup wasn't as easy. What can restaurants do in the long term to ensure that they're set up for success?
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point, Laura. And you know, restaurants, and we've seen restaurants during the shutdown, and they're continuing to do it upon reopening. They've really had to pivot and innovate and adapt to the environment to survive, essentially. So, you know, we have clients that are high-end restaurants that never did takeout and delivery, and now they're doing takeout and delivery. We have other clients that are adapting and doing meal kits at home or barbecue kits. We have clients that are doing partnerships with theaters where they're doing a virtual virtual theatrical production with home meal kits to all the attendees. And we've got, delivery of wine in packages to homes. So we've got all kinds of innovation happening. And I think that's been critical. A, for restaurant survival, but B, a lot of this adaptation. I mean, we don't know what the restaurant world is going to look like in 6 to 12 months. And adapting and figuring out how to diversify yourself or find new revenue and profit sources, I think is incredibly important, because what worked for a restaurant in 2019 may not work at all for a restaurant in 2021. I think the really important thing that restaurants need to keep in mind, with this innovation and with adapting to this environment, but not just with that, but with everything I've talked about, whether it's price increases, whether it's putting extra staff on to elevate the guest experience. I think restaurants need to realize that this is a whole new world. It's almost like a reopening a restaurant. It's almost like you're not the same restaurant you were 4 years. For 4 years, you're now something brand new. And the important thing is, when we're going into that unknown space, analyzing, reviewing, and adapting, and tweaking and adjusting, it's all a feedback loop. Which you mentioned earlier, which needs to be constantly monitored, because just putting your prices up 15%, that might not be the right answer. Maybe it should have been 9%, and maybe you should have done something different in how you elevate the experience. Or maybe the whole meal kits, maybe they were great when restaurants were shut down, but you know what? It doesn't really add to the bottom line. So we're encouraging restaurants during this time of uncertainty, during this time where we're all trying to figure things out, that they really need to pay attention to their P&L. They need to monitor more closely than they ever have before, and see exactly how these changes they're implementing are either working or not working, and how tweaks and adjustments can make them better. And if they do that effectively, the great thing about this, in my mind, is restaurants over the next 6 months, not only can they get back to profit levels pre-COVID, but if they do things properly, they could be making more money than they were pre-COVID. And if they really set it up well, when this whole COVID thing goes away and restaurants come back to normal capacity, I mean, they could be shooting profits through the roof compared to where they were before. So, this is kind of why we see it as just a tremendous opportunity. And restaurants need to say, you know what? Hey, I know I've had a bad few months. I know this has been horrible, but let's figure out how to make this work for us. And let's figure out how to rework our profit model so we can hit 2021 and make that the best year ever, right?
No, thank you so much, David, for your insights today. I think it's been a great way to reframe the opportunity we have in front of us. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Paul.
Thank you, Laura. On behalf of RBC and of our clients, thank you, David, for your insights, your advice, and your knowledge. As you mentioned, this has been a very difficult time, and it continues to be a very difficult time for many restaurant owners. I've helped clients for over 30 years, and seeing them face these challenges has been difficult. With the advice you've given, I feel more confident that I can provide some guidance and advice on how to help these businesses resume during this time. So on behalf of Royal Bank, thank you very much.
My pleasure. I very much enjoyed chatting with you. I'm always happy to chat restaurants.